If you have your New Testaments, be opening back up to John chapter 9 and place your marker there. That is where we'll be taking our lesson from this morning. We'll be looking at the entirety of that text in just a few moments. John chapter 9, and if you've placed your marker there, go back with me to Matthew chapter 17. Matthew chapter 17. Marker at John chapter 9, place your marker there. Come with me to Matthew chapter 17. When we open up our New Testaments to Matthew chapter 17, many of you being good Bible students know exactly the context that we are sitting in. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus has been proclaimed by Peter to be the Son of the living God. And as such, Jesus is now preparing his disciples for his imminent departure as he makes his way to Jerusalem. But prior to going to Jerusalem, there's other things that he has to do along the way. And one of those is what we find here in Matthew chapter 17 and verse 1. Jesus took alongside Peter, James, and John, and he took them up on a high mountain, which Peter would later call the Holy High Mountain. And it is there that Jesus is going to be transfigured. But there is something that happens in this text that I do believe we oftentimes overlook that adds value and depth to what it is that is being shown to us in Matthew 17. Look at with me at verse 2. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became white as light. His face shone like the sun. How many of you have ever looked up into the sun without any form of protection? And then how long can you do such? You can't do it very long at all, can you? Because if you do it for too long, it will literally blind you. I want you to see that there is a difference between what is stated here about Jesus versus what is earlier stated about Moses. When Moses beheld the glory of the Father there on Mount Sinai, and he descended off of Mount Sinai, his face shone because his face reflected the glory that he had beheld. But Jesus' face is not a reflection of God's glory. Jesus is God's glory. And there's a purpose, there's a reason that I want to emphasize that. And the reason I want to emphasize that is now come with me to John chapter 8. In John chapter 8, at the conclusion of the Feast of Booths that is being celebrated in John chapter 7 and 8, Jesus makes a proclamation in John 8 and verse 12 that should have caught the attention of all of those who heard it that day. In John 8 and verse 12, Jesus said this, I am the light of the world. I am the light of the world. And light always vanquishes darkness. That's the very purpose that Jesus has come. He has come to bring salvation to those in whom are lost. And Jesus has come to be the light of the world. And he emphasizes this once again in John chapter 9 in verse 5. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Well, how does Jesus prove that statement? How does Jesus prove that he is the true light of the world? I believe the easiest way and the greatest manifestation of him being the light of this world is that he healed a man who was born blind. And that's our journey this morning. That's our text. That is where we want to look at this morning. And as we journey through John chapter 9, I don't want us to read it verse by verse this morning, but rather I want us to look at it from the perspective of who am I in this narrative? Who am I in John chapter 9? As we read through John chapter 9 and as we focus upon different subcategories and subgroups of individuals and characters, I want you to introspectively look into your heart this morning and ask yourself honestly, who am I in John chapter 9? So let's begin with the first characters that I want us to think about, and that is the disciples. In John chapter 9 and verse 1, he passed by and he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who has sinned, or who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? And at the very outset, what we should see here is it doesn't make logical sense. Even their question just seems to be off kilter a little bit when they ask this. They've asked, who has sinned that this man be born blind? Well, if the man had sinned, then how did he sin in the womb of his mother to be born blind? That just doesn't make logical sense, does it? But then this question of, well, if he hadn't sinned, his parents must have sinned, because that's the understanding of the Jewish mind of the day, is that suffering equals sin. You think about that with the case of Job, right? Job's friends continually accused Job of what? Being a wicked sinner, and as such, Job has to valiantly show his integrity through this whole battle, through that whole suffering, and that's the entirety of the book of Job. And really, the disciples here become like Job's friends, who Job says in Job 16 and verse 2 were miserable comforters. They had a misunderstanding of what was going on here in John chapter 9. They are thinking that this man's parents have sinned, and because of such, God is punishing them with a son to be born blind. And you would think to yourself, well, why would they come to that conclusion? Go back with me to Exodus chapter 34. In Exodus chapter 34, I do believe they have their foundation here, or at least their misperceived or misunderstood foundation here. In Exodus chapter 34, you look with me at verse 6. The Lord is passing by and is announcing who He is. And as the Lord begins to proclaim who He is, He says, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness and truth, He who keeps loving kindness for 1,000, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin, and yet by no means leaves the unguilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of fathers on their children and on their grandchildren, on the third and fourth generations. So from that end of verse 7, you could make the case that, well, if this man was born blind, then either his mother and father sinned, his grandmother or grandfather sinned, or his somebody has sinned to bring about this man's suffering. Because suffering always equals sin. But what did Jesus say in response to their question in verse 3? It was neither him nor his parents have sinned, but it is so that the works of God might be displayed in him. You see, this man had been chosen to be born blind because at this moment, Jesus was going to be given an opportunity to manifest Himself to be exactly who He said to be. I am the light of this world. But the disciples seemingly, they misunderstood some things here, and because of such, they were struggling. They needed some help, and Jesus was going to do that for them through this miracle. The second group of characters that I want us to look at is the neighbors. Those who had seen and witnessed this person on a continual basis. The man goes and he washes in verse 7, and he comes back seeing, and then we're introduced to the neighbors in verse 8. And therefore the neighbors and those who had previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? And others were saying, this is he. And still others were saying, no, but he is like him. And he kept saying, I am the one. They're staring the evidence down face to face. They see him, they hear him, they know who he is, but even when the evidence is right there in front of them, the neighbors are unwilling to what? They're unwilling to say, that's him. And a great miracle has occurred. They're rejecting him. No, it's a person like him. You know, everybody has their person that looks like them. And really what's happened is just somebody that looks similar to him has come into the city, and we just didn't see that he had left and he has come in. It's trick, but it's not. In verse 10, they asked, how then were your eyes opened? And when they've asked that and the man gives them his answer, seemingly the neighbors kind of just fade off into non-existence for the remainder of the text. They have the evidence before them. They're willing to listen to a point, but when it begins to drop down a little bit deeper than what they really want, seemingly the neighbors just say, okay, I'm done with this, and they just move on with their lives. The neighbors had everything revealed to them. They could have stayed. They could have been a part of this. But it just became too deep too quickly. The third group that I want us to look at this morning that I believe this is the point that hit me so hard is drop down with me down to verse 20. And it's when the blind man's parents, his own parents, are brought to questioning. And here they're brought and they're asked the question, is this your son who you say was born blind? Then how does he now see? And their response is, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind and that he was born blind, but how he now sees. Let's stop there. The first time this blind man has ever seen his physical mother and father, he's heard their voices from the day he was born. He has been held in their arms when he was a child. But he has been left as a beggar on the side of the street by them. And here, the first time that he sees their mother, his own mother and father, the ones that I would pray that if something had ever stricken one of my children and them miraculously be healed from that, I would pray that as a mother and a father, as a father of my sons, I would have ran and I would have embraced my son and I would have loved my son and I would have done everything for my son. But the first thing that he sees in his parents, verse 22, is fear and being left alone. They respond, he is our son. We know that he was born blind. How he sees, we do not know. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself. And they said this out of fear. This man who had lived his entire life in darkness and in alone is rejected even by his own mother and father. That is a sad situation. But the mother and father paid more attention to what others may say. They paid more attention to the authority of others than they paid to their love for their own son. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. They cared more about their social status than for their own son, who was seeing them for the first time in his life. A fourth group that I want us to look at is the Jews, the Pharisees. And when we begin to look at the Jews and the Pharisees here in John chapter 9, we need to take note of immediately in verse 14 what it is that caught their attention, what it is that drew their ire, their angst, their hatred in John chapter 9. You look with me in John chapter 9 and verse 14. Now it was a Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Why did Jesus wait till a Sabbath day to do this? Why couldn't he have done it any other day of the week? Because Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is the Lord of rest. This man has been tormented and suffering in his blindness for his entire life, and Jesus is here to give him relief, to give him salvation. But yet this doesn't make the Pharisees happy. But rather, the Pharisees want him dead. They want to stone Jesus in John chapter 8 and verse 59. They picked up stones to stone him with. In John chapter 10 and verse 31, they picked up stones once again to stone him with. In John chapter 11, when Jesus had been notified about Lazarus and the death, or his sickness and soon to be death, Jesus delayed and he says, now let us go to Judea again. His disciples said, why are we going again? Do you not know that the Jews wanted to stone you just a few days ago? And then in verse 8 or verse 7, Thomas said, well, if you are going, let us all go with you so that we may die with him. Jerusalem equaled death because of the Pharisees. And that hatred of Jesus, that malice that just grew within them, ultimately came to fruition in John chapter 19 and verse 7 when they had rejected him as their king, rejected him as their Messiah and Savior, and gave him over to Pilate to be crucified. These Pharisees are simply just unwilling to acknowledge. Look with me in John chapter 9. Let's begin at verse 15. In John chapter 9 and verse 15, then the Pharisees also were asking him again how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he applied the clay to my eyes, and I washed, and I see. And therefore some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And there was a division among them. So even the Pharisees begin to face some division amongst the ranks, because they cannot deny the fact that a miracle has occurred, but at the same time, they cannot confirm the one who did the miracle. Or at least they do not want to confirm him. Drop down with me to verse 24. Because after the Pharisees have had this line of questioning with the parents, and the parents have abandoned their son, the parents say, you ask him. Well, the Pharisees come back to him. They come back to the man. And in the second time, in verse 24, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. Look at the boldness of the Pharisees. They're not just calling anyone a sinner here. They're calling the Son of God a sinner. They're calling Jesus a sinner. You think about arrogance. You think about pride. I think there is no greater source or sentence that contains it when they call the very God, who is the glory of God, a sinner. Drop down to verse 26. What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? The man had already told them twice what had happened. He had already told them twice what Jesus had done for him. But here the Pharisees continue to deny Jesus. They continue to reject him. Even when the signs and the miracles stand them in the face, the evidence is undeniable. Even then, we cannot accept it. And did they expect this man to change his answer so quickly? No, what they were doing is they were asking for different outcomes by doing the same thing. And I believe that is the definition of insanity, correct? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And seemingly the Pharisees asked the same question 3-4 times in the same chapter. What did he do to you? What did he do to you? What did he do to you? And every single time the man says the same thing. He did this, I did this, and I have this. And then finally, if you drop down to verse 34, when defamation of another man or another woman's character becomes your strongest tactic, you have lost miserably. And in verse 34, they are done talking to this blind man, saying to him, you were born entirely in sins, and are you teaching us? So they put him out. They went back to the very beginning of the chapter with the question that was asked of Jesus. Who sinned? Well, this man, he was born entirely in sins. Totally depraved. He is the one to blame. When defamation of another man's character becomes your strongest tactic, you've lost the battle. But there's somebody else that has a role in John chapter 9 that is beautiful to me. And it's the blind man himself. The man who in chapter 9 and verse 1 is just sitting along the roadside. And I don't know, and I try not to take too much liberty, but I wrote an entire article just thinking through this scenario. And that's this week's article. So if you've not picked up your bulletin, those are back there on that back right table. And we do those every week if you don't know. But in that article, I tried to capture this attitude of what it would have been like to have been that blind man on that particular day. After living a life of darkness, after living a life being all alone, after having to be led through the streets to your spot on the roadside, day after day after day, sitting there with your palms up, not even knowing who you are, what you look like, or anybody that passes by, and just crying out for meager means, just crying out for just a little bit of daily bread. And here he hears the feet begin to shuffle in front of him once again. And it being a busy week because of the Feast of Booths, he hears additional feet around him. And he's crying out, but yet on this day, he heard something that is unique. He heard a new voice. Because on this day, when he was sitting there, he heard someone say, it was not he that sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God be manifested through him. He heard a voice. And that same voice that he heard said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And that man, as tedious as it must have been, as hard as it must have been to get up as a blind man and make his way to that pool, he made his way to the pool, he washed himself, and then when he comes out of the waters, after he had washed himself, can you imagine in your mind's eye, he comes up out of that water and he looks down and he sees his own hands for the first time. He sees his legs and his feet. He sees the reflection of his face in the water. And immediately he knows something is greater about that voice. And when he's first asked about who it is that has done this, he said, Jesus the man in verse 11. He begins to realize Jesus is somebody. I've heard about Jesus of Nazareth, and now I'm coming to realization he is someone. He's asked before the Pharisees, who is it that's done this? There in verse 16, he says, he applied the clay to my eyes and I washed and I see. That's what's happened. Well, what about it? Well, who do you think he is? Who is this man? In verse 17, he is a prophet. He's not just a man, he is a prophet. And then finally, all the way down in verses 35 through 38, which I want to hold on to for just a few moments. The blind man saw Jesus as the Son of God. That progression of seeing Jesus as a man, seeing Jesus as a prophet, and seeing Jesus as the Son of God is a repetitive theme throughout the Gospel of John. Nicodemus does it. The Samaritan woman does it. It occurs to Jesus in John chapter 7 and John chapter 8. You can trace it. Almost every narrative account in the Gospel of John operates off of that premise. It presents Jesus as a man, it presents Jesus as the prophet, and ultimately it shows him to be the Son of God. And that was the conclusion that this blind man came to. But there in John chapter 9, there's one final character who again plays the most pivotal role. And that's Jesus. Jesus is the one who said in verse 5 that I am the light of the world. And to prove that statement, he spat upon the ground, he took that wet clay, he rubbed it upon his eyes and told that man to go and wash. And then Jesus he's not existent in the narrative. He goes. But then in verse 35, Jesus comes back. And Jesus heard that they had put him out, and finding him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Brethren, do not overlook the fact that this was the same voice that had told him to go and wash. This man did not know what this other man looked like. He does not know his face. He does not know his color. He does not know his clothing. He knows nothing about that man other than the fact that he knows the tone of his voice. And here he has been cast out. He has been rejected. He has been left alone by his parents. He's been cast out of the synagogue by the Pharisees and the Jews. But yet he hears that voice. Do you believe in the Son of Man? To which he says, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said, you have both seen him, and he is the one talking with you. And he said, Lord, I believed. And he worshiped Jesus. Only God is due praise and worship. So tell me, what did the once blind man believe about Jesus in verse 38? He's the Son of God. And what has Jesus proven to us here in John chapter 9 when he has said that I am the light of the world? He has proven that through this miracle. Turn back with me to Isaiah chapter 42. This thought of God in light is manifested throughout the book of Isaiah. You see it in Isaiah 9 in verses 1 and 2, Isaiah 29 in verse 18, Isaiah 35 in verse 5, Isaiah 42 in verse 16, Isaiah 60 in verse 1, and chapter 60 in verses 19 and 20. It is continually a theme that we find in the book of Isaiah to present that God is the one. He is the source of light. In Isaiah 42, I want us to pay particular attention to verses 6 and 7. In the midst of one of the servant songs, the Lord says this through Isaiah. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you. And I will appoint you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations, to open blind eyes and to bring out prisoners from the dungeon and those who dwell in darkness from the prison. Those who are held captive in the darkness, you will be their light. And when Jesus arrived on the scene, if you turn back with me now to the Gospel of John, John begins his entire gospel with a presentation of Jesus as that light. In John chapter 1, look with me at verse 4. In John chapter 1, look with me at verse 4. And in him was life, and the life was the light of man. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And thus, what John establishes here at the very beginning of his gospel is the presentation that ultimately is going to find its ultimate fulfillment in John 9, and that is that Jesus is that light. Look at John chapter 3 and verse 19. John chapter 3 and verse 19. This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and that men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, so that his deeds may be manifest as having been wrought in God. You come to the light. Jesus is that light. In John chapter 8, in verse 12, as we have already read, Jesus said, I am the light of the world, and he who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And brethren, in John chapter 9 and verse 38, the man who had lived his entire life in darkness not only could see the physical light of the sun for the very first time, but he beheld the glory of God, and he walked in that light when he worshiped him. So I ask you the question, Who best do you represent in this narrative? Where do you find yourself on that list? Now, again, I please understand that Jesus, He is the one that we are most to be imitators of. We are to imitate Christ. But who of those first 5 do you best represent? Do you represent the disciples who do not know and understand fully the depth, the height, the length, the breadth of God's compassion and grace toward all men? And as such, you need to pray that you have a better and a deeper appreciation. Then when God says, for He loved the whole world, that means He loved every soul. That means He loved those who are black. That means He loved those who are brown. That means He loves those who are red. That means He loves those who are white and yellow and any other shade of the color spectrum. He loves them. But how many times are we just like the disciples? We see somebody that is in the greatest need of salvation, but we make the excuse by a preconceived idea that they will not accept it because of who they are, or the way they are dressed, or where they may be at. Do we best represent the parents and the neighbors? Those who are afraid of what others may say or think, and even when the evidence stands us in the face and it's undeniable, we still yet fall away and we're not willing to stake claim. Or do I represent the Pharisee, who even at the end of this chapter, look with me at John chapter 9 and verses 40 and 41, the Pharisees don't just go off just yet, they come back. And in verse 40, they say, thus, those of the Pharisees who were with Him heard these things and said to Him, we are not blind too, are we? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains. In their pride and their arrogance, they were unwilling to see their true self. They were unwilling to see the stains that were scattered upon them from the sins that they were living in and among. They were still lost. Or do you find yourself in the blind man? Oh, would it be that I could just influence you to recognize that every single one of us are the blind man in John chapter 9. Every single one of us. There is not one person who hears the tones of my voice at this moment that has not been the blind man or not currently the blind man in their life. Because when you have sinned against your great and almighty Father in heaven, you have fallen into a pit of despair and darkness. And without Jesus, you would remain therein for all eternity. But thanks be to God, Jesus is the light of the world. He extends to us an invitation. He calls for us. He expects of us. And if we will but do what He has told us, we too can once again see as the blind man sees now. The opportunity is given to you. The choice is yours. If there is one here this morning that is in need of the gospel in any manner, we are here to assist you in the obedience of it. Will you come now as we stand and as we sing?